Welcome to our YouTube channel. Please subscribe for more lessons.
F4, in, B8 to H2 and C1 to H6 diagonals. H5, in, H5 to E8 and H5 to D1 diagonals. B1, in, B1 to A2 and B1 to A2 and B1 to H7 diagonals. E8, in, E8 to A4 and E8 to H5 diagonals. A2, in, A2 to G8 and A2 to B1 diagonals. E3, in, A7 to G1 and C1 to H6 diagonals. A1, in, A1 to H8 diagonal. A3, in, to F8 and A3 to C1 diagonals. E2, in, A6 to F1 and D1 to H5 diagonals. H8, in, H8 to A1 diagonal. C4, in, A6 to F1 and A2 to G8 diagonals. F1, in, F1 to A6 and F1 to H3 diagonals. B2, in, A3 to C1 and A1 to H8 diagonals. A5, in, A5 to D8 and A5 to E1 diagonals. B3, in, A4 to D1 and A2 to G8 diagonals. D2, in, A5 to E1 and C1 to H6 diagonals. D5, in, A8 to H1 and A2 to diagonals. D1, in, D1 to A4 and D1 to H5 diagonals. B7, in, A8 to H1 and A6 to C8 diagonals. G5, in, C1 to H6 and D8 to H4 diagonals. F8, in, F8 to H6 and F8 to A3 diagonals. E1, in, E1 to A5 and E1 to H4 diagonals. F7, in, A2 to G8 and E8 to H5 diagonals. H7, in, H7 to G8 and H7 to B1 diagonals. G1, in, G1 to A7 and G1 to H2 diagonals. C3, in, A1 to H8 and A5 to A5 to E1 diagonals. A4, in, A4 to E8 and A4 to D1 diagonals. E7, in, D8 to H4 and A3 to F8 diagonals. D4, in, A7 to G1 and A1 to H8 diagonals. F6, in, A1 to H8 and D8 to H4 diagonals. D7, in, C8 to H3 and A4 to E8 diagonals. F2, in, G1 to A7 and E1 to H4 diagonals. B4, in, A5 to E1 and A3 to F8 diagonals. F5, in, B1 to H7 and C8 to H3 diagonals. H1, in, H1 to A8 diagonal. F3, in, H1 to A8 and D1 to H5 diagonals. H2, in, H2 to B8 and H2 to G1 diagonals. A6, in, A6 to C8 and A6 to F1 diagonals. H4, in, H4 to D8 and H4 to E1 diagonals. B5, in, A6 to F1, in, A6 to F1 and A4 to E8 diagonals. C8, in, C8 to H3 and C8 to A6 diagonals. G4, in, D1 to H5 and H3 to C8 diagonals. E6, in, C8 to H3 and A2 to G8 diagonals. G8, in, G8 to A2 and G8 to H7 diagonals. G6, in, B1 to H7 and E8 to H5 diagonals. D3, in, A6 to F1 and B1 to H7 diagonals. C6, in, A8 to H1 and A4 to E8 diagonals. H6, in, H6 to F8 and H6 to C1 diagonals. E4, in, A8 to H1 and B1 to H7 diagonals. G2, in, F1 to H3 and H1 to A8 diagonals. G3, in, E1 to H4 and H2 to B8 diagonals. A8, in, A8 to H1 diagonal. H3, in, H3 to C8 and H3 to F1 diagonals. D8, in, D8 to A5 and D8 to H4 diagonals. C5, in, A7 to G1 and A3 to F8 diagonals. B6, in, A7 to G1 and A5 to D8 diagonals. C7, in, B8 to H2 and A5 to D8 diagonals. B8 to A7 and B8 to H2 diagonals. G7, in, A1 to H8 and F8 to H6 diagonals. E5, in, B8 to H2 and A1 to H8 diagonals. C2, in, A4 to D1 and B1 to H7 diagonals. C1, in, C1 to A3 and C1 to H6 diagonals. A7, in, A7 to B8 and A7 to G1 diagonals. D6, in, B8 to H2 and A3 to F8 diagonals.